On the last episode of the Pax Romana podcast, we talked about how the young Emperor Commodus was carefully prepared for the day he would take power. But for reasons that are not entirely clear, Commodus was nearly assassinated in AD 182. The attempt was unsuccessful, but Commodus seems to have been scarred nevertheless, and from this point on, the emperor became more reclusive, more paranoid, and more isolated than in those first few years when things were going relatively well. As we'll see today, in the years that followed, Commodus withdrew and left Rome largely in the hands of men who would rather fight each other for power than responsibly rule the city. The infighting among Commodus's inner circle would lead to a major riot in Rome, one that appears to have been in part engineered. We will talk about the strange events that led up to the riot and the conspiracy that may have been behind it on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 56, Conspiracies in the Age of Commodus. As we learned last time, Commodus was nearly assassinated, and the man who held the knife foolishly, instead of striking Commodus immediately, proclaimed that the Senate were responsible for what was about to happen. This obviously gave Commodus's bodyguards a few seconds to reach the assassin before he could strike, and the plot was foiled. Commodus wasn't harmed, but his actions suggest that he took to heart the warning that the assassin gave him. The Senate wanted him dead. And so, unlike Marcus Aurelius, who made the Roman Senate an integral part of his regime, Marcus listened to senatorial advice. He allowed the senators to run the city of Rome and much of the empire. He gave them privacy. He respected them. He acted judiciously toward them. Commodus would do the opposite, seeing the Senate as a threat. Marcus had given Commodus an excellent group of senatorial advisors, men who were wise and experienced to guide an emperor who really was too young to take office. Commodus, after all, was just 19 years old when he became emperor. So Commodus, in his paranoia, got rid of those advisors, and instead he surrounded himself with slaves, former slaves, women, and other such people who many senators would find unqualified and unfit to rule. In reality, as we'll see today, some of these people were very politically savvy. But I don't want to give you the impression that there were no elites in Commodus's administration. One of the most important men was Commodus's Praetorian prefect. The Praetorian Guard were the emperor's personal bodyguard, and their prefect was an elite. This man's name was Sextus Perennis. Perennis had been made prefect under Marcus Aurelius and had continued to serve in his post under Commodus. Our two main sources for what happened under Commodus' regime are the senator Cassius Dio, who had probably just gotten into the Senate during Commodus's reign. The other source is the Greek writer Herodian, who was not present for events in the city of Rome and indeed was a child while Commodus was alive, but would later write a history of the age from stories and evidence that he collected. Herodian describes Perennis as attempting to overthrow Commodus and take power himself, and that he had even minted coins with his image on them. That's one story. I think the more believable account, however, is Cassius Dio, who was there in the city of Rome. Cassius Dio says that Perennis actually lived a, quote, incorruptible and temperate life, and was otherwise a pretty decent character, but fell victim to a conspiracy within Commodus's own household. Cassius Dio's version of events goes something like this. Perennis found himself having to do far more than just manage the Praetorian Guard. Commodus was busy racing chariots and partying. Perennis therefore took up the slack, began supervising the soldiers and also managing affairs in the city. The soldiers, however, weren't happy with the way that things were going. Desertion was becoming a major problem in the Roman Empire at this time, and we have pretty good evidence that this was the case. An inscription from Asia Minor in the emperor's name commends one of the cities there for dealing with a roving band of bandits. The language of the inscription suggests that other cities in the area should also join in suppressing these bandit gangs that have risen up in the area. So there was a problem with this. We also have stories in the literary sources, gangs that were even larger than full Roman legions, rampaging through the Western Empire, provinces in Gaul and Spain and even Italy. And these bands were a combination of deserters, but also some runaway slaves as well, and former prisoners. So there was growing disorder and chaos in the empire under Commodus. British troops were called in to Italy to suppress some of the banditry that was occurring there. But instead, they made their way to Rome to seek an audience with the emperor himself. Now, what they told him is interesting. They evidently claimed, according to Cassius Dio, that Commodus needed to watch his back, that there was a conspiracy brewing led by his Praetorian prefect Perennis, and that if he didn't do anything about it soon, he would be dead. Commodus had a choice. He could stand down this mob of soldiers and trust his Praetorian prefect, as he had for years and years and years, a man who had been loyal to him even in the midst of other conspiracies against him, or he could sacrifice Perennis, not wishing to confront the mob, and take his chances with a successor. As you might guess, that's exactly what Commodus did. He listened to the soldiers, he gave Perennis over to them, they executed him on the spot. Then they went and found his wife and 2 sons and murdered them in cold blood. Now, it's kind of a strange story. Like, how would these soldiers even know that this was going on? The most likely explanation to me is that somebody put the soldiers up to this. And in my opinion, the chief suspect is a man who was hiding behind the scenes, waiting for his opportunity. A man of low birth. A former slave, in fact. His name was Marcus Aurelius Cleander. Yeah, that's right. His name is Marcus Aurelius. He gets that name because he was a slave under Marcus Aurelius, and the former emperor freed him. And when a Roman slave became free, he took up the name of his former master. And so we know that Cleander was a former slave freed by Marcus Aurelius because of his name. Cleander had been around Commodus from a very young age, and he clearly had significant influence. But as a former slave, Cleander could not obtain real political power. He could not be a senator, he could not be a magistrate, he could not be a commander of armies. So there was nowhere for him to go. But he seems to have been very ambitious, and he had influence with Rome's soldiers. And so maybe it was Cleander who put the lie in the soldiers' mouths that the Praetorian prefect was responsible for a coup, thus getting Perennis out of the way so that Cleander could take power. Commodus knew that nobody would accept Cleander in an official position of power. So instead, he invented a title for Cleander, Dagger Man. Now, as Dagger Man, Cleander had no official power, but he was, in effect, second in command to Commodus. And Commodus, at least nominally, had imperial power. What Cleander does in this intermediary position is begin selling access to power. Senators and other elites would give Cleander money and property, and he in turn would give their names to the emperor, who would endorse these men for positions of power, and they would duly be put in office. Commodus may very well have approved of all of this. After all, he could just let Cleander run the show, and presumably Commodus would get some of the funds paid, which he could then use on his extravagant parties and hobbies. The grift was successful for several years. Eventually, however, it got into absurdity. In the year 189 or 190, the sources are a little bit unclear on this, Cleander sold a whopping 24 consulships to various men. Now, the consulship was an ancient executive office. Under the emperors, it became tradition to have 4, 2 who were elected, and then midway through their 1-year term, they would vacate the office, and then the emperor would get the right to appoint 2 replacements. So a total of 4 consuls over the course of the year, 2 for 6 months, and then a second 2 for the second 6 months. But then Cleander decided to have 2 new consuls appointed every month. He was basically selling titles. You couldn't really do a lot of power wielding in a single month. That wasn't really the point. These men just wanted the trappings of the consulship. It was the highest office they could possibly obtain. So Cleander sold 24 of them. And then the 25th consulship was held by Commodus for the entire year. It was a total farce. It was a mockery of this venerated institution that was as old as the Roman Republic. But the corruption and grift and the desecration of tradition was ultimately not what did Cleander in. It actually appears to have been disease. Probably in the spring of AD 190, an epidemic struck the city of Rome. It was a particularly bad one. Cassius Dio, who lived through the epidemic, claims that 2,000 people a day died in the city of Rome. Now, you're probably wondering, because we talked about it on episode 50 of this podcast, if this disease that struck Rome in AD 190 was the Antonine Plague. Was it the same disease? We don't really know. In my research, which culminated in my book, Pax Romana, I came to the conclusion that it seems wisest to treat this epidemic as separate. But whatever it was bad. And the timing could not have been worse. So this thing hits Rome in spring. And as you probably know from episode 56, which talks about food and climate in the Roman Empire at this time, food shortages were a serious problem in numerous parts of the Roman Empire, but also in the city of Rome. Rome relied primarily on grain from Egypt, and that grain did not come in until the seas calmed down, and then the trip could be made all the way from Alexandria to Rome, a trip which had to go counterclockwise around the Mediterranean, and it took several weeks to arrive. So what that means is grain normally didn't arrive in Rome from Egypt until summertime. So by the late spring, grain would be getting short in the city. And if the previous year was not a very good year, then people might already be starving. All that is just to say, this epidemic that struck in the spring seems to have been exacerbated by a growing food shortage in the city. And both Cassius Dio and Herodian mention that. This is what Herodian says in Book 1 of his history. A plague struck all Italy. The suffering was especially severe in Rome, since the city, which received people from all over the world, was overcrowded. And then a little bit later, he notes, famine gripped the city at the same time. So this was a nasty combination of disease and famine. What would this have to do with Cleander? Part of it is just the simple fact that Cleander was in power and Commodus was nowhere to be found. One of the things that we are told is that because of the plague, Commodus left the city. He just booked it out of the city. This is not unlike what Marcus Aurelius did when the plague hit Aquileia when he was there in AD 169. As I mentioned in the last episode, episode 55, Commodus may have had a pretty serious bout with disease as a child, and I'll just say I happen to think he was pretty scared of disease. And we know that he left town. So Cleander was left with a city full of starving and diseased people. He does not have any real loyal friends. Members of the elite, of course, even those forced to pay him for offices, would have deeply resented him. Here was a man who was their social inferior, and yet they had to come to him begging for offices. One of Cleander's greatest enemies was the grain commissioner. His name was Papirius. Papirius was a well-pedigreed elite from an established family that had the favor of Marcus Aurelius. Papirius had hoped to earn the highest governorship that was available to a member of his class, which was the governorship of Egypt. But Cleander happened to get in the way of that appointment. We don't know how, but he evidently prevented Papirius from getting this governorship, which basically killed his career. And so Papirius could go no higher than the grain commissioner. Papirius and Cleander obviously did not like each other, and both were in the city of Rome during this period of famine and disease. Two different narratives of what happened survive, one in Cassius Dio, the other in Herodian. I want you to hear what Herodian says because I think it tells us that there may have been a conspiracy to get rid of Cleander. Herodian places the blame for the famine on Cleander. He says this, quote, Cleander bought up most of the grain supply and put it in storage. He hoped in this way to get control of the people and the army by making a generous distribution of grain at the first sign of a food shortage, anticipating that he would win the support of the people when they were suffering from a scarcity of food. That's Book 1 of Herodian. So the claim here is that the food shortage was actually caused by Cleander, who evidently wanted to overthrow Commodus and take control of the people of Rome and the army as well. I have to tell you, I think that story is preposterous. There is no way that Cleander, former slave, would be tolerated at all as Roman emperor. Now, this kind of thing would happen several decades later, but I still don't think people were ready for this at this point. Instead, we have Cassius Dio's account, which is very interesting. Just so you know, Cassius Dio hated Commodus. He did not like him, okay? And he also did not like Cleander. So what Cassius Dio says is especially fascinating. He says, quote, a famine occurred, sufficiently grievous in itself, but its severity was vastly increased by Papirius, the grain commissioner, in order that Cleander, whose thefts would seem chiefly responsible for it, might incur the hatred of the Romans and be destroyed by them. I think this is pretty significant. Cassius Dio has every reason to join in the pile-up against Cleander. Cassius Dio does not like Cleander. And yet, Cassius Dio indicts one of his fellow elites, Papirius, in a conspiracy to get Cleander out of the way. To me, that is far more believable than what Herodian says. And I think Herodian, who gets his stories later on, probably got the narrative that survived, which was actually not true, but the victors get to write the histories. And so if we didn't have Cassius Dio, we would all think that it was Cleander that manufactured the crisis, when in reality, it was Papirius, the grain commissioner himself, the guy who is supposed to actually ensure that the grain supply is taken care of and that people are fed. He helped manufacture the crisis to get Cleander out of the way. But the conspiracy goes even deeper than that. In mid-April, the Romans celebrate the festival of Cerealia. This is a festival dedicated to Ceres, goddess of grain and agriculture and the harvest. Obviously, this festival would be a bitter time during a famine. People would be gathering, offering festivities to the goddess, hoping that grain would come to the city. One of the major events of the festival was a gathering in the Circus Maximus. This venue could support up to around 150,000 people. And they came, and they were hungry, and they were sick. And somehow, coincidentally, some children came out into the grounds of the Circus Maximus. And the children began chanting insults against Cleander. The crowd, person by person, took up the chant. And pretty soon, 150,000 people were denouncing Commodus's second in command, Cleander. This was a riot in the making. Now, at this point, we would expect the main peacekeeping force in the city, the urban cohorts, led by the urban prefect, a man named Pertinax, and you should remember that name. He will come into our story very shortly. Pertinax was commander of the urban cohorts, the peacekeepers of the city of Rome, but strangely, Pertinax did not order the urban cohorts to quell the crowd. In fact, one source claims that instead of subduing the growing riot, the urban cohorts allowed it to happen. They stepped aside, even joined the rioters as they began marching through the city as these diseased and hungry masses burst into violent anger. One historian who I respect quite a lot, a man named Olivier Hexter, actually calls this an engineered riot. And I think he's right. So Commodus, who was hiding outside of the city for fear of plague, soon finds himself surrounded by a mob of tens of thousands, maybe more, all demanding the head of Cleander. How did they know where Commodus was? Who directed them to go there? I don't know. Another interesting facet of this strange conspiracy. We saw what happened last time when Commodus was confronted by just 1,000 soldiers from Britain. He gave in. The people who surrounded Commodus, including his mistress, Marcia, seemed to have advised Commodus that he needed to placate the crowd, that he needed to get rid of Cleander. And that's exactly what he did. Commodus had Cleander executed, and he gave the corpse to the crowd, which they desecrated and destroyed in a fit of mob rage. So finally, members of Rome's elite got what they wanted. This man who had forced them to beg for offices was out of the way. Unfortunately for these same elites, however, something happened that they did not foresee. With the death of Cleander, Commodus had nobody left he could trust. He was not going to put senators back in power, and so there was only one option. Commodus decided to take the reins of power himself. And he had now survived plagues, famines, usurpations. Commodus got the idea in his head that he was not a normal man, that he was, in fact, a god. But as we'll see in the next episode, far from bringing heaven to the city of Rome, Commodus made life for the Romans, and especially the senators, a living hell.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.